Dear respected viewers, some lives are shaped by their time. Others shape the times themselves. Aristotle did both. He stood between two giants of history. He was the student of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great. In a single lifetime, Aristotle bridged the world of philosophy and the world of power, the world of ideas and the world of action. But Aristotle was not merely a link in a chain. He was a force all his own. He wrote not just about wisdom, but about life itself. He studied biology, logic, ethics, politics, poetry, psychology, and more. He searched for answers in everything, from the stars above to the plants underfoot, from the workings of the mind to the structure of a just society. And through it all, he asked the same timeless question: how should we live? Unlike Plato, who looked to a perfect world of forms, Aristotle turned his eyes to the world as it is. Messy, complex, real. He believed that truth could be found not just in the heavens, but in observation, reason, and the rhythms of daily life. He was no king. He was no conqueror. And yet, he shaped the very foundations of how we think, how we learn, and how we live, even today. So now, we invite you to step back in time, to a small town called Stagira, where a curious boy was born, and where the journey of a true giant began. This is the story of Aristotle, from student to legend. Dear viewers, our story begins not in Athens, not in a palace, nor in the courts of kings, but in a quiet corner of northern Greece, in a small town called Stagira. It was here, in 384 BCE, that a boy named Aristotle was born. He did not come from a family of philosophers or poets. He came from a family of physicians. His father, Nicomachus, was the personal doctor to the king of Macedon, the same royal house that would one day raise Alexander the Great. So from an early age, young Aristotle was surrounded not by scrolls or speeches, but by the rhythms of the natural world, the beating of the heart, the cycles of illness and healing, the deep order hidden in the body and the stars. He learned to observe. He learned to listen. He learned that everything has a cause, and that understanding begins by looking closely. But tragedy would shape his early life. Both of his parents died when he was still a child. He was taken in by a guardian and moved away from Stagira. The boy who had been born into privilege was now surrounded by uncertainty. And yet, even in this quiet disruption, Aristotle's mind did not close. It opened wider. Perhaps, like many of us who have faced loss early in life, he learned that answers don't come easily, that certainty is rare, and that to seek truth, patiently, persistently, is to honor life itself. By his late teens, he was already known for his sharp thinking and curious nature. And so, around the age of 17, he made a decision that would change his destiny. He journeyed south to Athens. There, in the city of wisdom, awaited a man who would become his mentor, a thinker who had once been a student himself. His name was Plato. But before the great questions of politics, ethics, and science, before the academy and the writings, there was simply a boy in a small town with a mind full of questions and a heart ready to learn. Dear friends, when young Aristotle arrived in Athens, he stepped into more than just a city. He stepped into the beating heart of philosophy itself. The city still echoed with the memory of Socrates. The shadows of Plato's dialogues danced through every courtyard and column. And at the edge of the city, in a quiet grove dedicated to the hero Academos, stood something truly unique: the Academy, the world's first true university. Here, learning was not about reciting facts. It was about wrestling with truth, about questioning the world and oneself, about sitting with doubt and refusing easy answers. And here, Plato taught. Now, in his later years, Plato had become a legend in his own time. He taught through dialogue, through paradox, through parables that turned the mind inside out. And Aristotle, only 17, but bright beyond his years, quickly stood out. He absorbed ideas like the dry earth absorbs rain. He read everything. He questioned deeply. And most importantly, he respected Plato, but did not always agree. You see, Plato believed that the physical world was just a shadow. That truth lived in the realm of eternal forms, beyond what we can see. But Aristotle, even as a young student, sensed something different. He looked at the world around him, the birds, the stars, the laughter in the streets. And he thought, isn't truth here too? In what we can observe? In what we can test, examine, understand? He did not challenge Plato out of pride. He did so because his mind demanded it. And Plato, to his credit, allowed it. He saw in Aristotle not just a follower, but a fellow seeker. Aristotle would spend 20 years in the academy. 20 years of study, debate, and discovery. He became both student and teacher, learning from Plato while quietly laying the groundwork for his own philosophy. And though their paths would one day diverge, the respect between them never faded. Dear viewers, many of you may know the feeling to admire someone deeply and still find your own voice, to walk behind a teacher and yet eventually step beside them. That was Aristotle's journey in the academy, not one of rebellion, but of growing into his own mind. He entered as a boy from Stagira and began to emerge as Aristotle. Dear viewers, even the brightest student must, one day, find his own voice. For 20 years, Aristotle walked the gardens of the academy. He debated with scholars, read deeply, and sat at the feet of Plato, a man he deeply respected, even admired. But admiration is not the same as agreement. Plato taught that the true world was not the one we see, touch, or measure. He believed that beyond our senses existed a perfect realm, the world of forms, where perfect truth, beauty, and justice reside. To him, this world, the world of change, of imperfection, of things that age and break, was only a shadow of that higher truth. But Aristotle, he could not accept this fully. He looked at the world and saw not illusion, but structure. He saw a world full of purpose and potential, a world not to be escaped, but to be understood. He believed that every tree, every star, every creature held within it a reason for being. He called this the final cause, the purpose for which a thing exists. He did not see ideas and reality as separate. He saw them as woven together, form and matter, working in harmony. Aristotle did not reject Plato. He refined him. He brought philosophy down to earth. He turned his eyes to biology, to politics, to ethics, always beginning with what he could observe, test, and explain. All men by nature desire to know, he wrote, but knowing, to him, required looking at the world as it is, not just as it ought to be. This was more than a philosophical difference. It was a turning point in the history of human thought. Plato had dreamed of the perfect. Aristotle chose to study the actual. He began to write, not dialogues, but treatises. Not poetic inquiries, but carefully structured explorations of life, logic, and meaning. And slowly, he stepped away from the academy. Not in rebellion, but in quiet independence. Dear friends, perhaps some of you have known what it is to honor a teacher and still walk a different path. To say, thank you for showing me the way. Now I must continue in my own steps. That was Aristotle's moment, a gentle, powerful turning. He did not discard the wisdom of his master. He carried it forward, shaped it, stretched it, and gave it new life. And in doing so, he began not just to learn philosophy, but to become a philosopher himself. Dear friends, it is a rare thing when a philosopher is called not to write, but to shape the soul of a future king. That is exactly what happened to Aristotle. In the year 343 BCE, Aristotle received a summons. It came from King Philip II of Macedon, a man of ambition and conquest. He had a son, clever, fierce, destined for greatness. But he needed guidance, and the king knew this boy would one day rule armies. But first, he must learn how to rule himself. And so he turned to Aristotle. For many, this would have seemed an impossible match. Aristotle was no soldier. He had spent decades in libraries and courtyards, not battlefields. But he understood something far deeper, that the soul of a ruler must be forged with wisdom before it commands with power. And so, Aristotle returned to the land of his birth, Macedonia, not as a student, but as a mentor. His pupil? A 13-year-old boy with fire in his eyes and destiny at his heels. His name was Alexander. Yes, that Alexander, the one who would later be known as Alexander the Great. For the next several years, Aristotle became more than a tutor. He became a guide through philosophy, science, literature, politics, and ethics. He introduced Alexander to the works of Homer, taught him logic, rhetoric, and the nature of virtue. He taught him to think, not just to command. He told him stories of justice and of tyranny. He warned him that greatness without wisdom could become cruelty. That conquest without understanding leads only to ruin. Whether Alexander listened fully, we may never know. History tells us he admired his teacher deeply, but ambition often drowns out reflection. Still, the roots Aristotle planted in that young heart would echo across continents. Some say it was Aristotle who inspired Alexander to carry books with him as he marched through Asia. That even as he conquered empires, he remained a student, if only in part. But for Aristotle, this chapter was not about glory. It was a duty, to try if he could, to shape a leader whose hands would one day hold the world. Dear viewers, many of you have known what it is to teach a child, a grandchild, a student, a friend. And you know that the heart of a teacher does not seek power. It seeks only to give the next generation the tools to be better, to be wiser, to be good. That is what Aristotle gave to Alexander. Not orders, not praise, but perspective. And whether or not the student fully embraced it, the lesson was given. Dear viewers, there comes a time in every great life when the journey turns full circle. Years had passed since Aristotle left the academy. He had studied, taught, and even walked alongside kings. But now he returned, not to follow, not to challenge, but to build. It was the year 335 BCE. Athens, though no longer at the height of its power, remained the center of thought and learning. And here, near a shaded grove dedicated to Apollo Lyceus, Aristotle founded a new kind of school. He called it the Lyceum. Where Plato's academy had soared toward the ideal, Aristotle's Lyceum grounded itself in the real. And the way they taught? Radically different. You see, Aristotle believed that learning wasn't just for the mind, it was for the body, the senses, the full experience of living. And so he walked. Yes, he taught his students while walking back and forth through covered walkways. They discussed politics while pacing among the trees. They questioned nature while strolling past flowering paths. That's why they came to be known as the Peripatetics, those who walk around. But don't let the simplicity of the method fool you. Inside those shaded paths, some of the most important thinking in human history took place. Aristotle didn't write grand dialogues like Plato. He wrote systems. Carefully organized, deeply observational studies of everything from animals, to the stars, to the structure of a sentence, to the purpose of a life. He cataloged species. He dissected ethics. He laid the foundation for biology, logic, economics, politics, poetics, and more. It's said that his school kept a vast library, the most comprehensive of its time. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Lyceum was not what was written. It was the spirit in which it was taught. That truth begins with careful attention, that thinking must follow evidence, that the world is not to be rejected, but studied, respected, and understood. Dear friends, many of you have walked long paths in life. You know that wisdom is not sudden. It arrives slowly, step by step, often while walking through the ordinary days, asking quiet questions. That was the Lyceum, not a tower of ivory, but a living school, a walking conversation with the world. And at its heart, a man with a scroll in one hand and the world in the other. Aristotle, the teacher, the walker, the builder of knowledge. Dear friends, some thinkers leave behind a book, others a theory, but Aristotle left behind entire fields of study. No philosopher before, and few since, have matched the sheer breadth of his mind. At the Lyceum, Aristotle didn't just reflect on life, he analyzed it, named it, organized it. He believed that knowledge should not float in the sky. It should be grounded in observation, reason, and clear categories. And so, one by one, he built the pillars of disciplines we still rely on today. Biology. Aristotle was one of the first to systematically study living organisms. He dissected animals, recorded behaviors, and searched for patterns in nature. He grouped creatures by type, vertebrate, invertebrate, and studied reproduction, adaptation, growth. Many of his observations, though imperfect by modern standards, remained unchallenged for nearly 2,000 years. Logic before Aristotle, people argued, but no one had defined the rules of reasoning. Aristotle created what we now call formal logic, with terms like premise and syllogism and conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Simple, elegant, foundational. His work in logic became the toolbox of thought for generations to come. Politics and ethics. Aristotle believed that the purpose of politics was to create the conditions for people to live good lives. Not just to govern, but to guide. He studied existing governments, monarchies, democracies, tyrannies, and weighed their strengths and dangers. He asked, what makes a life good? What makes a society just? In his work Nicomachean Ethics, he explored the idea of virtue, not as a rigid rule, but as a balance between extremes. Courage, he said, lies between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and waste. He called this balance the golden mean, a guide for character, not just conduct. Poetics and aesthetics. Even the arts were not beyond his reach. In his Poetics, Aristotle explored tragedy and storytelling. He analyzed how pity and fear could purify the soul, what he called catharsis. He studied structure, character, plot, laying the foundation for dramatic theory that continues to influence writers and filmmakers to this day. Education, psychology, rhetoric, astronomy, the list goes on. To Aristotle, no field was too small, no detail too trivial. The world was a book, and every page deserved to be read. Dear viewers, in a time long before laboratories and universities, before telescopes and microscopes, there stood one man with a pen, a mind, and an unshakable belief that the world was knowable, that truth could be pursued with discipline, and that human beings were not just made to survive, but to understand. Aristotle did not just ask questions. He built systems so others could ask better ones. He didn't close the book on wisdom. He opened a library. And for that, we remember him not only as a philosopher, but as the father of many disciplines. Dear viewers, every great journey must one day return to stillness. For Aristotle, a man who had shaped kings, founded a school, and charted the very structure of thought itself, the end came not with applause, but with suspicion. The winds in Athens had shifted. Alexander the Great, his former pupil, had died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE. And with his death, old tensions flared anew. The city of Athens, long wary of Macedonian influence, turned inward with anger and fear. And though Aristotle had not ruled, though he had never picked up a sword, he was still seen by many as too close to the empire now crumbling. They began to whisper, to question his loyalties, to accuse him, just as they had once accused Socrates. He recognized the signs. And so, rather than face the same fate as his master, Aristotle left Athens. He is said to have remarked, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy." He withdrew to the city of Chalcis, on the island of Euboea. There, far from the colonnades of the Lyceum, he lived out his remaining days. His health was failing, his energy diminished. But even then, he continued to write, to think, to teach. Until, at the age of 62, Aristotle passed away. There was no grand funeral, no marble monument. But his words, his questions, his structures of thought lived on. In a world that often rewards force over wisdom, he had chosen a different path, a slower, deeper one. He had seen kings rise and fall. He had guided an empire, then been cast into exile. And yet, through it all, he remained what he always was, a student of nature, a servant of truth, a man who believed that the soul grows by understanding. Dear friends, perhaps you too know what it means to face endings with grace, to walk away not in defeat, but in quiet strength. Aristotle's final days were not filled with fanfare, but they were filled with meaning. He had lived a life not of conquest, but of comprehension. And when the world turned against him, he did not shout. He simply turned the page and kept writing. Dear friends, some voices fade when the body falls silent. Others grow louder with time. Aristotle's voice was one of the latter. When he died in 322 BCE, he left behind no empire. No monuments bore his likeness. No armies marched in his name. And yet, his thoughts would become the foundation of empires yet to rise. In the centuries that followed, his writings would ripple outward, across borders, languages, and civilizations. His works were preserved, copied, debated, and eventually translated across the ancient world. Greek thinkers studied him. Roman philosophers revered him. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars in the Middle Ages rescued his wisdom and carried it forward. In places like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Paris, his writings became the cornerstone of education. The Catholic Church would later call him simply the philosopher. In the Renaissance, artists and scientists, from Leonardo da Vinci to Galileo, built on the logic he had designed. In the Enlightenment, political thinkers turned to his ethics and views on governance. Even today, in universities around the globe, his words are studied not as relics, but as living blueprints of how to think clearly, how to argue honestly, how to seek truth with humility. Logic, ethics, biology, rhetoric, political theory, literary criticism, metaphysics, education. All of these carry his fingerprints. But more than facts or theories, Aristotle gave us a way of approaching the world. With wonder, because all knowledge begins in awe. With discipline, because clarity demands effort. And with purpose, because the goal of life is not merely to exist, but to become flourishing human beings. He called this flourishing eudaimonia, the state of living well, with virtue, balance, and reason. That, dear viewers, is the soul of Aristotle's legacy. He didn't offer easy answers. He offered a path, one we are still walking even now. And perhaps that is the true mark of greatness. To plant ideas that grow beyond your own time, into places you'll never see and minds you'll never meet. Aristotle did not just ask, what is true? He asked, how should we live? And that question, timeless, personal, eternal, still calls to each of us across the centuries. Dear friends, we have traveled far, from a quiet town in Stagira to the echoing halls of Athens, to royal courts, leafy gardens, and the corridors of timeless thought. We have walked beside a man who never sought power, but shaped emperors, who never ruled a city, but helped build civilization. Aristotle didn't chase glory, he chased understanding. And through that pursuit, he gave us a gift. Not just knowledge, but a way of looking at the world. With clarity, with curiosity, with care. He taught that reason is not cold. It is the fire that lights the path. That ethics is not abstract. It is how we treat one another day by day. That learning is not a task. It is the soul's greatest joy. And though he lived over 2,000 years ago, his questions are still ours. What is a good life? How do we build a just society? What does it mean to be human? Dear viewers, Aristotle may have left this world long ago, but his presence endures. In every thoughtful conversation, in every honest question, in every moment when we choose wisdom over impulse. He was more than a philosopher. He was a guide, a gardener of the mind, a teacher of how to live. And though he is gone, his voice still speaks, not through power or noise, but through reason, virtue, and the enduring beauty of a well-lived life. He was Aristotle, and he taught us not just how to think, but how to be.